What we're gonna do right here is go back. Laying the wax and spinning the sound. What we're gonna do right here is go back. Laying the wax and spinning the sound.
How's it going, everyone? So in today's video we're going to be continuing the kind of 90s organ house series, but we're going to be focusing on a label called Bass Jamz, and we'll be referencing the track A Fresh Energy by Gaskin, which was played out a lot during the summer by likes of like Jamie Jones. I basically have attempted to kind of reference the kind of sounds and techniques and then kind of done my own thing, so there's kind of a lot to digest. If you want the full project to get all these sounds and that kind of thing, then I have also linked that down below. So that will be included in the Patreon with the kind of like sample pack, organs, and then I'll also link the kind of full sample pack as well, which recently dropped. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first kind of group is essentially like the kind of like vocals.
Laying the wax and spinning the sound.
So this is just all of them playing at once.
Energy. What we're gonna do right here is go back. Way back. Laying the wax and spinning the sound.
So like loads of different ad-libs. I've kind of gone over this trick before, basically trying to find vocals that kind of play off each other.
Laying the wax and spinning the sound.
So it's mostly ad-libs, phrases, and like effects and textures.
What we're gonna do right here is go back.
So if I just kind of run through them, I've got this kind of main one here.
Laying the wax and spinning the sound.
So essentially within like the 90s kind of sample libraries, you get these kind of tracks. So this one's from the Ecstatic Goldmine from eLab. Essentially within these kind of like files, you basically get a bunch of like tracks which have loads of stuff to addition. So essentially what I've done is basically skimmed through these to find something that's semi-usable, like these kind of like phrases.
Laying the wax and spinning. Hold it. What?
You get these kind of like vocals which are like quite dorky, kind of almost, and they work really well as like these phrases.
Laying the wax and spinning the sound.
So you can basically like chop them up like that. So that's essentially kind of like the main kind of vocal. The next one is this kind of like energy. You've probably heard it used so many times, including in the original. There we go, energy like that. No, George Baker has used it. Coulter's used it as well. So like it's been used loads of times, but this kind of vocal comes from a pack called Boo Records. It's like a big kind of D&B sample pool, and it's got a lot of these kind of
unjust
Power. Noise. Power.
and more of those kind of like ad-lib phrases I was talking about. So got that, got this.
What we gonna do?
So this is kind of comes from like one of those kind of like old school kind of packs, and I think what I've essentially done is basically taken it and kind of warped it in like different ways. Like,
what we're gonna do right here is go back.
so basically kind of like,
What we're gonna do right here is go back.
I'm basically using it as kind of like a fill.
What we're gonna do right here is go back.
And then like the last kind of one, what I've essentially done is I've basically taken it from that to kind of like stretch it double time.
What we're gonna do right here is what we're gonna.
And then
What we're gonna do right here is.
it's kind of like a technique that's used a lot in like rave, kind of like jungle. It's this kind of like pitching and stretching.
What we're gonna do right here.
And then we've kind of gone for like the texture kind of trick.
Wait, back.
So I've basically dropped it into a kind of like drum rack and basically sliced it up in different ways.
What we're gonna do right here is go back.
To take different like textures.
Way back. Back into time.
So if I just play it.
Way back.
So that's kind of like the energy increasing. You see it's basically brought in on like part 2 of the drop, and then during the build. And it's like building. Something that can be quite good to have in these is essentially putting kind of like distortion, overdrive kind of effects, quite subtle. And it kind of helps to accentuate certain textures on the voice. The next one is kind of similar to what I was saying about the different tracks. So that ELAB pack is really good for these. I think I actually just ended up utilizing the majority of the sounds within the track, something like this, and then cutting them up and placing them.
There's a oldie but a goodie. Got a workstation in there. They've got a computer and a...
There's these kind of like really like nerdy kind of vocals. Basically, they'll just like chop them up during the breakdown, and it works really well.
There is a right way to go. An oldie but a goodie. Got a workstation in there. They've got a computer and a television screen.
Sometimes you can't even hear them, but it doesn't really matter. It just kind of helps to like fill that break. Something, well, I remember here as well, like there's things you can do when the lyrics say certain words, like kind of mixing decisions, which are kind of quite smart. So in this kind of case, it's like automating a delay or echo, so whatever he's saying corresponds to what you're hearing, kind of thing.
31 seconds, and we're on for auto sequence start. Here we go now.
So like, just a bunch of nonsense really, but for this kind of case where there's like less elements in the track, having something like this, just a new vocal, and in this case I've just been able to use the same one, but having that kind of like new vocal can really help.
And you're ready to flow.
And this vocal just works really well. I've kind of done something a bit different with the arrangement, and this vocal just really helps to kind of tease.
And you're ready to flow. And you're ready to flow. And you're ready to flow.
So that's kind of like the main kind of like phrases / ad-libs, and then you get onto more like SFX fill type sounds. So something I've noticed, I've obviously spoken about packs a lot before and samples, but you can use like plugins for some vocals. The one that I've used a lot in this project is the SOTA stance tracks. If you go to like patch C73, I think it is, there's like these Vox menus, which are like different sounds for different notes, essentially. I'll just play some examples. Essentially, you've got like different kind of effects for this. So like a breath, so just kind of fillers. And it might be basically an example of doing too much. I think it just helps to have these kind of sounds basically at the end of every 8 bars and at the start of every 4, maybe, possibly even 8. You'll see it varies throughout. And then I've just got another one here. See what that is. Just similar kind of concept with like loads of echo. So basically just trying to like fill the mix with ear candy. And this one here, which is like an old school kind of jungle. It's kind of these like jungle kind of.
We need jungle, I'm afraid.
But it's this one. And I basically just kind of stretched it. You can basically adjust the kind of start marker as well. to loop it in a particular way. And then I've probably, I think I've like doubled it. Just to like make it weird. So that is essentially all the vocals. So the next group we have is essentially this kind of like low end group. So you'll see it's a bit different from how I normally set it up, but sometimes it can be kind of helpful to basically group your kick and bass together, and then you can kind of process them and gel them together as one. So essentially I've got this kind of like separate low end group, got the kick here. What I've done is I've taken a kick from DeMarzo. So sampling other tracks' kicks is something that people won't tell you they do, but they do. And I've basically taken this kick, and it's often quite hard to get like a really clean sample when you're kind of sampling those kicks. So what I've essentially done is I've taken this kind of like kick stealer audio rat, and it's basically set up in a way to kind of isolate certain frequencies and that kind of thing. So without, there's some like clickiness to it that I'm not really keen on. So I basically use this kind of kick tool to kind of add more punch. And then what I can do is basically detect the highs I don't want. And I can add transient, I can add punch and that kind of thing. So essentially, if you're going to be sampling, using these kind of like isolation tools can kind of help you get a cleaner result from that. And then what I've essentially done is kind of like beefed it up with drum bus and a tool I've come across recently called Brainwork Subfilter. And you can basically, I don't really play around with it much, but what I would do is like basically if I wanted to add some more punch, you'll notice the difference there. You can kind of dial into taste. So just for a bit of extra punch. And then we've got the kind of two bass layers, sorry. So we've got the kind of like M1 organ. So I've taken this sample from our kind of like organ sample pack, which I'll show just now. It's a pretty safe sound to use, and I find when you kind of integrate it into your project, you can keep the MIDI pretty simple and the sound processing doesn't require too much. So it's a sound that's pretty good to go from the off. We've basically got that kind of M1, and the MIDI is not too dissimilar from the original, but in the original, it literally just follows like 4 notes. I think one of the kind of things about using the M1 as an organ, just organ basses in general, is that you don't really need to overthink the MIDI. You can just have that kind of simple pattern, and then you can start like fleshing your track out based on that. And it kind of leaves room as well for everything else that you want to add. I've got that, and then I've got this kind of sub, which I've taken from, I've basically taken it from an Ableton stock patch called Guitar Bass. I know a lot of like users like Robbie Doherty and SOTA also use these, but I've not used it in its full form because the layer I want is kind of like a sub, so I kind of want it to sit underneath. So I've basically got this in this kind of frequency range, and then I've basically got the sub. I'll click on them both together, and you can see how they change. So you see the top line kind of takes more notes, and then the kind of middle one comes in as and when. I think I've talked about this before, as like they're both working independently of each other, but they also work in kind of combination as well. It makes it more interesting than essentially just taking the same layer and bringing it down and having just thickening up that layer but having it play the same thing. So it means that if you wanted to duck one out for any one reason, it could stay in rhythm.
Energy. What we're gonna do right here is go back.
So that's basically the MIDI, and then what I've essentially done for the processing is filtered it down massively to about 80. And something I've noticed, like when I was doing subs, and like when I used to create subs, is I used to create them from scratch, but I always noticed the sub patches sounded really weak and you could like barely hear them when you did it in that way. So what I've kind of started doing recently is essentially either duplicating the main bass layer or finding a like main bass patch that's separate and then kind of dialing it down. So that's kind of what I've done with this to take it from where you probably can't hear it that well, but you can kind of still hear it slightly and you can almost feel it as well. And then what you can do is to essentially like beef it up the sound is basically add like a saturation before it. So that is essentially the low end. So next up we have the drums, and obviously there's a lot of like overlap with this, so I'll kind of touch on stuff pretty quickly if that's the case. But essentially we've got the three main groups, the claps and snares. So I've got this kind of pretty fat clap. Most of these sounds are just like raw kind of like drum machines, and I wouldn't like stress yourself out over like having loads of different drum samples, because a lot of them are basically the same with different processing and they're basically based on kind of similar drum machines. So essentially kind of you can use the Ableton stock ones, you can find like other drum machine examples, like to name off the top of my head, Go Baby is a good example. So basic clap with the snare groove. The kind of snare roll is quite interesting because in the past I'd always thought like 16th grids was the kind of go-to one, but something I've like trialed with is like 32, so 16. But something I hear in their music is these kind of, firstly there's like their fills change at the end of like every 8 bars. Like sometimes the fills sound pretty different, like they use different variations. So you see there, that's straight that's 32s till the last kind of bar, and then it's the 16th. And then this one starts with the kind of 16ths and then goes into 32s and then back into 16ths. So basically experimenting with like different variations throughout your track can be something that's going to be pretty cool to do.
What we're gonna do right here is go back. What we're gonna do right here is go back.
And you're ready to flow.
And it's not something you necessarily pay attention to, but it can just help to make a massive difference in that regard. Then we have open, but it's kind of shorter open. It's almost closed in a way. It's an 808. I think I've layered that with a loop, which can be something that can be good to do if you want to add some kind of intensity to a sound. This one's a bit heavier. Then we've got a ride, like increased energy. Then we have a close tap. And then the velocity as well. We've got a kind of drum rack, I believe, with like 6 or 6 sounds. So this is like the Ableton stock I was telling you about. And it's just functioning as a kind of extra hat layer where they're like sporadically playing. I've got these kind of like, these ones here, And then something that's quite cool about Ableton drum machines is they've basically got this kind of function called choke. So when one note plays, another one cuts out. It's kind of like simulating a real kind of drum machine, so, or a real drummer. So if you've got a long sample like this, the second this plays, it basically cuts out. And then we've basically just got a bunch of like 16ths, so probably won't even be able to hear that. With like different velocities, you'll see the common theme here is instead of just placing the notes, I've kind of taken more care over the velocities, so just adding variation, especially when you've got like 16ths and it's notoriously repetitive, like it's constantly in your ear. You kind of want to add that kind of variation. So I've got tambourine, I've got shaker. Basically playing more or less the same thing with a different sound. Then I have the crashes. More constant than probably I would normally. Because normally I'd have it as like the fill, but here I've more or less got them at the end of every kind of like 4 bars. You can't really hear it as much, but so kind of as a general rule of thumb, like every 8 bars you kind of want to be doing something like by either adding an element or kind of taking away elements to basically tell the listener that something new is going to happen, or there's going to be a slight change up, and then just kind of like reverse crashes. So SFX. So that's essentially the hats, which leaves us with this so far. So it's basically your basic beat with some differences. It's probably a slightly more advanced version of the basic beat, and then kind of a key part of this genre is essentially when they're using kind of like these 90s sample libraries. So the one I've noticed them using is basically this one, the Best Service Dance Mega Add-on Groups. You've basically got a lot of loops that just like instantly add energy to a track and kind of fill it out. So you see, just like the second you add one of them, it just makes a massive difference. So I've kind of just done that. I think with the processing here, I've not really done too much apart from like mostly just side chaining and adding reverb and a bit of saturation to kind of fit these loops into the track. If you want to get like extra creative, you could almost like start adding like phasers, that kind of thing, bandpass filters to almost put them more in the background, but it depends how like prominent you want them to be. The final loop was a pretty late addition, and it's just kind of goes back to these kind of filler kind of segments that I was talking about, and I think I just had a sample from this kind of track here. It's like a drum break, and I basically just thrown it in. It probably could be lower in the mix actually. Basically just a drum break, like it's not even a perfect loop, but I just find like in these gaps drum breaks can be really useful, and this kind of genre has loads of them, so I just threw that in fairly last minute. But
What we're gonna do right here is go back.
you see it works really well with the effects as well down here. So yeah, that is essentially the drums. So the final part I kind of want to talk about is like the synths. So the first kind of element, which is essentially like the main kind of lead synth, is this like acidy texture. So I've essentially got two patterns. One is playing like every bar more or less, and then one's kind of a more stripped back version of it. So it's kind of like this nice kind of like acidy kind of layer, which just kind of helps. And the way it kind of works is kind of response. So it's not really playing like the kind of typical melody you associate, it's kind of just bouncing off and like responding. So it's kind of playing the column response, it's kind of playing like that kind of response part of that. And then it just becomes more sudden. I've just experimented with different versions of that same pattern. So the actual sound is, I started playing around with this kind of CZV Arturia plugin, and I believe it's just one of the leads, and it sounds like just like a nice textured synth. Like, I'm not really overthinking these things, but something that can be quite cool if you have like any kind of Arturia synth is basically playing around with these kind of parameters down here. So you don't need to be like a sound design wizard, but essentially starting with like a preset and then essentially playing around with any of these four kind of parameters will get you pretty far without having like a knowledge of sound design. So if there's anything that you're looking to tweak and you want an easy way to do that, these kind of parameters. So essentially what I'm doing is just kind of playing around with the different settings. So basically just using LFOs to kind of move those and change the state of those over time. You'll notice they never sound the same, or rarely sound the same. And then I've got another LFO just moving the delay. So just stuff you can do like that. Just this kind of plugin and like the whole Arturia bundle is one I'd definitely recommend checking out. Just taking this kind of like really raw sound and adding interest through like movement of parameters, like using LFOs to do that. And the MIDI is just like really basic as well. So it's kind of performing that role of being that kind of main lead, but not really in a way as well. So that's kind of like the main kind of synth, and then it's got these like synthy textures. Spoken about them to death at this point, but just kind of recap. Essentially just placing like one note and holding it on like an RP kind of preset. So I'll not kind of revisit that because it's pretty basic. Just pick the root note, hold it, and either load an arpeggiator before a preset on 16ths or just find an RP kind of preset. So these kind of ones with like sequences. So I basically just found a sequence. I'll take it off. See, you can get pretty creative with it. It doesn't even have to be the ones that are specifically ARPs. You can take like any sound. A cool trick I've learned recently is like basically using Tantra to create like this kind of gated effect. So without. And then what you can essentially do is load kind of like the default preset, and then you can start adjusting this setting here, which will probably look something like this when you first load it up. And then what you can do is you can basically pull it back to make it really, really glitchy and gated, and get like a happy medium. So basically just dialing that in, and then if you want to go further, you can essentially go to like different gate settings and basically adjust these things here. I've got that, and then I've got like a bandpass sweeping because I don't want the whole sound. I've done that same trick with the other sound, and they both kind of play the exact same pattern. It's kind of just layering. Done that. You'll see just how like effective that kind of tantra trick is. It just makes it extremely glitchy then together. So, very cool trick to try. So those are the textures. Chords. We have pretty simple chord, which is literally just like one note. And I think that's like a common kind of trick with this kind of genre in general, is there's a lot of like patterns which are single notes, and they either use the chord plugin or they're layered with other sounds to kind of create chords. So I've basically just picked 2 presets from the SRX dance tracks, which is, I mentioned before for vocals, but it's really got loads of really cool 90s kind of inspired sounds in there by Roland. And I've got this kind of like texture one. So I've basically just layered that. And I've not really done much else. It's just kind of a case of picking the right sounds and just picking something that works. You'll see the notes are literally just 2 notes. One of them isn't even in the scale as well, doing that kind of like chromatic. Can be something that can be quite cool to do as well, but I'll not get into that.
Laying the wax and spinning the sound.
So that's one of the layers. Then you've got this, which is also single note, but it's playing a fifth, so 7 semitones up, which is like a really cool trick you can try if you want, like, if you don't want to kind of like program the chords in manually. It kind of saves you that pain. You can basically focus on playing like one line and turning the part into a chord. So it's like a really handy trick, and kind of like fifth chords are pretty common in this kind of style. So I basically just got 2 more kind of presets from the SRX and made them into a chord this time. But this one, and once again it's single line. I think a lot of these kind of patches are like polyphonic. You can get like a lot of like polyphonic kind of patches, which means you only have to play one note. As you'll see, like the melodies aren't like overly complicated. Literally like 3 notes, which I think is one of like the main things about this style. It's about like how you can make the simple things work well. The final thing is just kind of these kind of like pads. So I've kind of done the same kind of chord trick, and I've essentially just taken like wavetable synth. There's something I've noticed is like, yes, you can go through all these plugins and find like really nice sounds, but it's also fairly easy to kind of recreate them from scratch using like just Ableton stock and get like pretty professional sounding stuff. So basically what I've done is I've used Wavetable, and I've basically gone to the retro and percussive organ. You could, in theory, use literally anything. This is what I would have started with. So just really basic, and then I would have brought that up. turn this off as well. Then what I would have done is added another kind of sound, so that could be literally anything. I think I've just gone for the default one. And brought it up like that. And then what I've essentially done here is I've pitched the whole sound up another 7, so it's a 5th chord. So it'd be like a equivalent of C to G together. But if I was to turn that off, what I could even do is I could layer the chord. I could basically put one of the tones up 7, so it's another thing you can do. Like there's loads of sound design like possibilities and stuff. So what I'd essentially do is play around with the sound, play around with this mode to kind of find a timbre that works, layer it, and then if you want you can pitch it up, but we're using a chord device here. And then the final kind of thing, which just makes a massive difference, is basically adding like unison, where you can pick a certain mode. So I'd pick classic. And then just some basic effects, space, modulation, filters, delay, and then this, because of the type of sound it is, I've got it ducking quite extreme.
Here we go now.
So it's kind of like a harmony pad. And then for the final thing, I've basically just got like a few kind of effects. So this one, basically like for transitions. And then something I'm noticing quite commonly in, maybe not as much like this specific label, but in the kind of genre itself, is like these kind of like wheel spin effects. Basically these kind of effects which give off like a slowdown effect, which can work quite well with like breaks and stuff. So I never really like talk about effects too much, but I thought I'd just briefly touch on them. So yeah, that's essentially the effects and essentially the entire project. So yeah, that's pretty much gonna be it. I hope you found it useful and learned something more about the genre and the kind of Bass Jamz label we were referencing. As a reminder, remember if you want the kind of project, that will be included below, as well as other relevant resources like our sample pack. And on your way out, if you can give us a like, comment what you want to see next, and subscribe. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.
And you're ready to flow.